In the year 2019, my first daughter was born. But the second best thing I did that year was buying Opus Magnum. In addition to being a great new dad game, I would prove to be really quite good at it. Over the course of the next few years, I would go on to set many world records and place top 10 in community-run tournaments year after year. Why did I put world records in quotation marks? We'll get to that. But let's back up. What even is Opus Magnum? Well, it's a puzzle game by the iconic Zachtronics studio about making alchemical machines. It sounds more complicated than it really is. You get some input atoms and an output molecule-shaped hole, and your goal is to assemble this molecule and drop it in the hole. You do that with these grabber arm thingies and these glyphs which change the atoms in some way or another. The arms can be coded with basic instructions like grab, rotate, drop, return, etc. And so you lay out some arms and glyphs and assign instructions to each arm. Then you hit play and the machine you built starts to run. And in all likelihood it will crash. So you adjust your layout, modify your instructions, and once everything is in its right place, you hit play a final time and if your brain is anything like mine, this is extremely satisfying. For example, here's a relatively simple puzzle in the game's opening chapter called Airship Fuel. The idea here is to take 4 of these fire atoms, stick them together in a zigzag shape using a bonding glyph, and turn 2 of them into salt using a calcification glyph. But what makes the game interesting is there's no limitation to how you achieve this goal. You have infinite space, can lay as many parts as you want, with as many instructions as you want. As long as your output looks like this, nothing else matters. So this is a valid solution, and so is this, and so is this, even this. As far as the game is concerned, these machines are equally good. They each solve the puzzle, and after you've built one solution that works, you can move on to the next level. But suppose you're not satisfied with simply making a passing solve. What if you want to make a good solution? What even is a good solution? Well, the game gives you 3 metrics by which you can measure your machines: cost, cycles, and area. Cost measures the total value of all the parts and glyphs of a solution. Each has a price in G. Arms are 20G, piston arms, which can extend and retract, are double that at 40. Bonding glyphs are 10G, track is 5G per section, etc. A good cost solve then tries to get this total number as small as possible, using as little stuff as possible while still solving the puzzle. This usually looks like one arm, maybe on a few pieces of track, with the minimum number of glyphs needed to assemble the output. Cycles measures how fast your solution is. Every action takes 1 cycle's worth of time to complete. For example, grabbing an atom, swinging an arm, dropping the atom, then swinging back, that all takes 4 cycles. Almost all puzzles require you to build 6 products, and the game counts the number of cycles from hitting play to dropping the 6th product. The lower the cycles, the faster the machine, the better your score. Cycles-focused solutions are usually the biggest, most impressive machines. This usually looks like lots of arms working at the same time to pull inputs as fast as possible and reduce the latency from start to finish. For my money, this is the most difficult way to play the game, but also very rewarding. And then we have area, which measures the size of your solution, and of course smaller is better. Not only does the game count hexes with parts and glyphs on them, but any hexes used in swings as well. This arm only takes up 4 hexes, but once you swing it, it takes up 13. A good area solve is going to be tight, with just 1 or 2 pistons usually, making careful and calculated moves so as not to accidentally creep outside the minimum boundary. Of course, in my first playthrough I ignored all of this, as it was often challenging enough simply to solve the puzzle. I guess my most common style would have been 1 main piston doing as much as possible with a few extra arms here and there as needed. This is not a good strategy for any metric, and I was well aware of it, but I was having fun anyway. In fact, every time you complete a puzzle, the game shows you a histogram of everyone's solve across Steam, and you can see roughly where your solution sits in comparison. Each of these bar charts represents one of the three metrics. The thick line is your solution score in that metric, and the bars are everyone else's. If it's a decent solution, it might be ahead of the pack on one of the metrics, but lagging behind on others. The nice thing about this game is that even when you think you've made a real stinker, it's probably, not always, going to be ahead of the curve in some way. So after I completed the main campaign, I dove headfirst into the post-game, the journal puzzles. These really up the difficulty and complexity, but fortunately each one is unlocked from the get-go, so if I was having difficulty or not enjoying myself with a puzzle, I could easily move on to another. It was around this time that I started trying to pay more attention to optimization. I wasn't necessarily aiming for any particular metric, but I might notice when a piston could be replaced with an arm on track, saving 10 G's worth of cost. And I would browse the Opus Magnum subreddit to look at other people's solutions, although mostly it was just people showing off their symmetrical invisible inks. But that's also where I found the leaderboards. Here I could watch GIFs of the best solutions for each puzzle and in each category. The best cost solutions. The best area solutions. The best cycles solutions. These ones are always crazy. But there was a fourth category, sum. This word never appears anywhere in the game, and at first I couldn't even tell what it was optimizing for. But then I realized it's not optimizing for any specific metric, but the sum of all three. In other words, if you add a solution's cost, plus its cycles, plus its area, you'll get its sum score. And looking at these solutions, I was entranced. They weren't flashy or extreme in any way. They just looked nice, balanced, clean. They almost looked like the way the puzzle was intended to be solved, whatever that means. Let's go back to airship fuel. Here is its cost record. Here is the cycles record. And here's the area record. But here is its sum record. Isn't that just nice? There's an elegance here that's difficult to pinpoint. It seems at the same time precise yet effortless, intangible yet obvious. To me, the question, how do you solve this puzzle, had an answer. This is how. I learned that sum was an entirely community-implemented metric, not one that the game tracks in any capacity. Still, I was really smitten by this way of playing, and so, as I was working my way through these endgame puzzles in a somewhat random order, I started trying to solve them in this balanced method. Eventually I came across this one, Van Berlo's chain. This is a special type of puzzle called a polymer, where instead of making individual products, you have to create an endless chain in this direction. And so I got to work on it, and this is what I came up with. I thought this was pretty good, but I just had a sense that it could be improved. In particular, I didn't like how it needed two arms attaching atoms to the chain. So I tinkered with it some more, and I ended up with this. This, I knew, was good. Really good. The puzzle gives you two individual salt atoms as your inputs, and I put them together to be grabbed simultaneously by this hex arm, which can then bind them together and run them past this guy called a Van Berlo wheel, which converts the salt into the colored elements. But what I was really proud of was this little arm attaching the atoms to the chain, and the way it gets the geometry just right by grabbing the pieces at different parts of the track. Just like that airship fuel solution, this one looked so effortless. The histogram confirmed that this solution was good. It wasn't the fastest, the smallest, or the cheapest, but it was ahead of the curve in each category. I was so impressed with myself that I thought I would check the Reddit leaderboard and see how far off I was from the sum record for this puzzle. I had no delusions that this was a record. The game had already been out for about 3 years at this point, and surely the sum records were well optimized by now. So I calculated my sum score, 389. I went to the leaderboards to see what the record was. 390. What? Did I really just set a record without realizing it? I honestly couldn't believe it. But I double and triple checked my math, and yeah, I was better by one single point. So I find the record submission thread, upload a GIF of my solution to Imgur, type out my score, and hit post. I don't know why, but I'm sweating bullets that I've somehow done something wrong or gotten confused and made a mistake. But in just a few minutes, I get a response. Record submitted. And there's my solution on the leaderboard. I made the best machine. For this particular puzzle, for this particular metric. It's hard to describe the feeling of elation that this tiny little achievement gave me, knowing that I was the absolute best in the world at... Wait, what the fuck? Less than 24 hours after my submission, elation turned to devastation. A user by the name of Mr. Puzzle had casually beaten my record by 6 cycles in 2 area. 8 points better than my effort. And the most frustrating thing was that his improvement was actually an oversight on my part. You see, the way these polymer puzzles work is you have to fill out the chain to a specific length, and in doing so you'll eventually cover every atom in this output glyph, at which point you win. However, there's this little ellipsis icon here at the end, which is meant to indicate that the atoms are allowed to go on forever in the chain. My assumption was that this symbol needed to be covered as well in order for the puzzle to validate, but that was incorrect. And so my machine was wasting time and area adding 2 unnecessary atoms to the front of the chain. Perhaps if I was a little more patient and thorough, I would have noticed the mistake. But it was too late now. Mr. Puzzle saw the error and corrected it. He even found a variation with the same score, adding an extra segment of track, which added 5 cost, but saved 5 cycles. It was a method I hadn't even considered. Mr. Puzzle had stolen my glory. Mr. Puzzle was now my enemy. Mr. Puzzle, of course, would turn out to be one of the absolute nicest people, a pillar of the Opus Magnum community, creator of the most useful and most popular mod for the game, the unfortunately titled F'tsigt'k'tu. Really just an all-around upstanding guy. But I didn't know that. I was filled with bloodlust. And so I was determined to get another record, but I wasn't sure if that was even possible. Maybe I just lucked into a really good layout for Van Berlo's chain, but I was going to try anyway. So I combed through some old solutions of previously completed puzzles, looking for anything that might have a hint of that intangible sum goodness. I assumed that the journal puzzles would be easier to crack than the main campaign, given that the campaign puzzles are relatively easier and have had 3 years worth of eyeballs on them. And yet, my next record did in fact come from the campaign. Chapter 4, Stain Remover. I'm still quite proud of this solution. This puzzle tasks you with attaching 4 arms of alternating colors to a core of tin. And I discovered a nice, efficient way to do that with this hex arm and tribonder combo. I was starting to realize that hex arms are somewhat overpowered, except of course when they're overrated. This time I really locked in and made sure the score was as low as I could get it. I wasn't going to have another player steal my glory again. And my efforts did pay off, lowering my score by a further 9 points. This brought it to a total of 23 points lower than the existing record. I submitted it to the leaderboard, and was tense for like a week, worried that somebody else was going to see something I missed. But no one did. But I was just getting started. My next 2 records came from the journal, and were comparatively quite complex puzzles. First up was Wakefulness Potion. I won't get into the specifics of this particular solve, because shortly after my submission, it happened again. Someone improved my design. This time it was a user named Jinyu, who is probably one of the best players in the world at this game. My next submission was for a puzzle called Embalming Fluid, and it's another beast of a solution. The top section makes the 4-atom core of the output, and the bottom section makes 3 of the 3-atom appendages. Crucially, both sections produce waste, but this little champion here manages to handle the waste from each of them by himself, and the timing just works out miraculously. But again, it was very quickly improved upon, and again by Jinyu. Here's my version, here's his. Can you spot the improvement? It's this bit up here. But by now I was a bit more familiar with the community, and this didn't bother me as much. In fact, the leaderboards don't give any attribution to the records, leaving them essentially anonymous. This is very unusual for a video game leaderboard, but for Opus Magnum it kind of has to be this way. When a record gets added, the community naturally wants to check it out, which means you suddenly have a lot of people who are very good at the game looking at and scrutinizing your solution. It's very common for someone to set a new record, and then 3 or 4 other players spot optimizations for that record. And after countless rounds of these kinds of revisions, who deserves the title of record holder? Whoever was lucky enough to spot the final optimization? The original designer? What if they borrowed elements from an older solution? It all becomes too muddy. And so the community decided to avoid this problem altogether by omitting attribution. I think it was the right call. GNU is a perfect incarnation of this phenomenon. Every record submission thread would have a post like this, where each one of these is a new record from GNU, across every metric, and most if not all of them are optimizations of solutions submitted by other users. GNU is like a whetstone, sharpening the leaderboard to a fine point. So I no longer got the bloodlust when my records were beaten, but in this case I felt there was more work to be done. So I went back to the wakefulness potion and pulled a GNU on the man himself, improving upon his improvement. I even had the hubris to call this my greatest achievement ever on Reddit. Don't tell my kids. This solution is pretty slick though, I gotta say. Look at how this tri-arm grabs the inputs, debonds the salt, moves one into position, and simultaneously chucks the other one in disposal. Absolute cinema, some might say. With even more hubris, I cheekily taunted GNU in the comments on Reddit, but he couldn't find anything better. No one could. For the time being. But let's take a minute here and talk about the sum metric itself, and why I think it's so interesting. On a first glance, it's a little counterintuitive, because area, cost, and cycles have no inherent equivalence. In other words, the metric is adding unlike terms, which is rarely a useful operation. Multiplying unlike terms can sometimes be useful, like you can multiply your height by your weight to get your body mass index. But if you added your height to your weight, it's nothing. The units don't match up. The resulting sum tells you nothing about the person or their health. It's nonsense, meaningless. And yet, in this game, it very consistently results in a metric measuring something that, if I'm being plain, I would call efficiency, but if I'm being poetic, I would call elegance. And it's kind of a miracle that this works. No other Zachtronics game has a similar category. For example, Space Chem has 3 metrics as well, cycles, symbols, and reactors, but they're not balanced like the metrics of Opus Magnum. A typical Space Chem solve might have 600 cycles, 50 symbols, and 1 reactor, maybe 2. If you were trying to make a sum solve in this game, you would essentially just be trying to lower your cycles, since the other 2 metrics are negligible in comparison. But in Opus Magnum, each of the 3 metrics carries a similar weight. Well, that's not exactly true. Of the 3, area tends to be the least relevant, leading to something of an inside joke in the community that you can just ignore area when solving for sum, but that's a bit of an exaggeration. Still, there's a remarkable balance between all 3 metrics, and it leads to interesting trade-offs. And this fact turns each puzzle into a, puzzle. How fast should I be grabbing inputs? Is 1 bonder enough, or should I have 2? Can I make this swing with a length 2 arm instead of a length 3? There's a million questions you can ask, and there's often no definitive answers. And so the only way to really tackle a sum solve is to try things out, hone your intuition, and sometimes create over 100 solution files. Other metrics are a bit easier to dig into, at least conceptually, because each one has a sort of algorithm you can follow to find that metric's minimum, or min. But with sum, there's essentially no way to prove that a solution is at a minimum. For simple puzzles like stabilized water, with a bit of tinkering you can convince yourself that its sum record is unbeatable. But for even slightly complex puzzles, it becomes impossible to know for sure. There's a running joke in the Opus Magnum community that goes something like, if God played Opus Magnum, he would get min sum for every puzzle. Thus the idea of minimum sum is sometimes referred to as the God solve. Aiming for the God solve is of course the dream of any sum optimizer, but the maddening thing is you can never really know if you've done it or not, short of having a supercomputer brute force every single layout under a given size. Anyway, let's get back to the year 2020, and my record streak is not even close to over. By the end of the year, I'd set records in unstable compound. This one's pretty nice. Suture thread, though this one was just tying the record. Warming tonic, another tie. Assassin's filament, where I beat the existing record by 54 points. This is a weird one. Lambent 2/9, in which I beat the existing record by 89. This is definitely one of my favorites. Celestial thread. Silver caustic, another personal fave. Spyglass crystal. Ablative crystal. General anesthetic. Animismus buffer, which was an improvement of 81. And visillary anesthetic, which was a whopping improvement of 104 sum points. Visillary is not a real word, in case you were wondering. I was feeling pretty good about myself heading into 2021 when I noticed a post on the subreddit. There was going to be a tournament open to everyone. It was to consist of 9 custom-made puzzles, each with 2 specific metrics against which the solutions would be judged. I was really excited to take part, but also a bit nervous, as while I was confident in my sum abilities, this tourney would be testing all sorts of metrics which I had little experience in. But I figured that since optimizing for sum required working with every metric, how bad could it be? Well, it didn't start great. There was a non-scoring test puzzle to kick off the tournament and get people warmed up. It didn't have any listed metrics to solve for, so naturally I decided to make a sum solve. I was very confident in this solve, but I made a mistake. This puzzle asked for 12 of each output instead of the usual 6, which messes with the delicate balance of the 3 metrics and increases the importance of optimizing for cycles. As such, my solve was demolished by one made by the legendary user BiggyMac. The next puzzle was the first scoring round, and the metrics were area and cost, and I did okay. I was off by 1 hex for area, and I missed an interesting strategy for cost. But the next week was a sum week, so now it was time to lock in. And the puzzle was a bit of a monster as well. I really dug into this one, to the detriment of the other metric, but my hard work paid off. I came in 3rd place with this guy. Actually, I tied the 2nd place sum score, but area was the tiebreaker, and unfortunately my solution was bigger. Annoyingly, during the results stream, I noticed a way to shave 2 points off my solution, which would have given me a solid silver place, but still not quite enough to take gold, which was this beautiful contraption by the user Panic. Anyway, I won't go week by week, but I'll just say that my performance gradually improved as the tourney went on, and I even managed to nab 2 first place finishes. One for a cost puzzle, which was unexpected, and one for a sum puzzle. Hey, we got there.
Okay.
Goodbye, Galaxy. Congratulations on first place.
Combining
This is the
that,
layout we haven't seen before.
but it's combining a lot of the good stuff from previous things.
Yeah.
This is a really clever and clean solve.
All
Goodbye
right.
Galaxy once again being like a dominant summer. Oh, and it's also 69 area. Incredible.
Overall, I ended up in 6th place. Not too shabby. Right behind Mr. Puzzle. we meet again. Actually, by this time I knew that Mr. Puzzle was a great guy, but for the sake of this video's narrative, he must remain my nemesis. Over the next few years, I would keep setting records, mostly in the journal puzzles. My mantra was cheaper and slower. I found that many of the existing sum records were tuned a little too fast, and I was frequently able to beat records by cutting costs, just like capitalism. I was at the point where if I thought I could beat a puzzle, I was almost always able to, with a few frustrating exceptions. At my peak, just over 50% of all sum records in the journal were either my designs or existing designs that I contributed to. Not to brag, but you know. But let me tell you about one specific puzzle. It is the last one in the campaign, the final boss, so to speak. It is called Universal Solvent. It requires you to engage with a little bit of almost every mechanic in the game: metal purification, animismus, duplication off a Van Berlo wheel, all that on top of a large and cumbersome output shape. I've been trying to bring this record down since I started my sum journey, burning through over 70 iterations. But on September 15th, 2021, I finally did it. Let me take you on a tour of this solve. Hopefully you can follow along even without knowing the specifics of what I'm talking about. This arm activates the animismus with 2 salt, which creates a vitae and Morse atom. It then grabs the vitae and moves it onto a bonder. This arm purifies the lead into tin, but also grabs the Morse beneath it and moves it onto a bonder. This arm does all the Berlo duplication and bonding required for the elemental inner ring. This little guy attaches all the outer salt atoms and outputs the final product. But the hero is this big arm in the center, grabbing the tin, ducking and dodging to get the vitae and Morse attached, and making sure the product is pivoted just right to get every atom in place. This was by far the most complicated arm to program, and the entire solution is dependent on it. Now, obviously, I love all my children equally, not to mention my actual human children, but this solution is certainly the crown jewel in my repertoire. It's not as impressive as a cycle solve. In fact, it looks a little basic. But that's the beauty of some. They're understated, elegant, simple. They just look like, in my opinion, how the puzzle was meant to be solved. And of course, as soon as I posted the record, someone noticed a single point shave almost immediately. Whoops! Now, you might be surprised to learn that this game's community is still quite active, especially considering it's a niche puzzle game from 2017. Thus, the leaderboard is constantly evolving, and not all records last forever. In fact, the beautiful airship fuel solve that ignited my love for some was beaten. The new record is fine. This looks good too, I guess. And such was the fate with many of my records as well. My Assassin's Filament solve was murdered. My Celestial Thread unraveled. My embalming fluid, which I called my greatest achievement, was put in the grave. Even my very first record for Van Berlo's chain was broken. But that's the way it goes. I'm still hanging on to a good chunk of records, and each improvement is another step towards the God Solve. And I've still got my Universal Solvent, for now anyway. I wouldn't delude myself into thinking this could possibly be a God Solve. I mean, look at this big swing here. It's using a lot of area. And 3-track? Seems a bit much, doesn't it? Actually, this whole solve seems a bit expensive. Could be that slower and cheaper is still the winning strategy. Maybe someone watching this video will find a way to beat it. I would actually love that, and I will update the description of this video if that ever happens. Really, the takeaway from this video is hopefully that you should play Opus Magnum. It is a truly wonderful game, and even if you've never played an engineering type of game like this, you should know that I went to film school. This kind of stuff isn't in my wheelhouse at all, but now it's one of my favorite games of all time. And if you try this game, and if it clicks with you, I really recommend you try optimizing for some, even just for a puzzle or two. It really is a fun and unique way to play. In fact, as far as I know, Opus Magnum is the only game with this type of gameplay experience. Let me know in the comments if you know of any other games that might scratch this itch, because I'm dying to play some more. Now, that would be the end of this video, except there's one narrative thread left hanging. Did I ever get my revenge on Mr. Puzzle? Well, 2021 wasn't the only tournament.
In first place, we have Goodbye Galaxy, with a sum of 484, which is quite a bit of improvement.
Yeah, like, pretty much as soon as I opened this puzzle up, I just looked at it, I'm like, Goodbye Galaxy's gonna eat this up. I just get this sense.
So, Goodbye Galaxy sent me a prediction saying they tried very hard to improve on this, but couldn't find any improvements, so they figured this was probably at the minimum. At least it's local minimum. So yeah, congratulations to Pentavig for getting first place in the tournament, and Mr. Puzzle for 5th, and Goodbye Galaxy for 10th. Mr. Puzzle for 5th, Goodbye Galaxy for 10th.
Hey, Goodbye Galaxy snuck in there.
And then next up, we have a drop of 1. Goodbye Galaxy.
I beat Goodbye Galaxy!
Achievement unlocked, beat Goodbye Galaxy at a sum puzzle. And
Alright.
The sub main is back.
yeah, we got a 7 drop to our first place solve.
Holy.
Goodbye
Oh,
Galaxy.
71. See, I think Goodbye Galaxy's even better at sum 4 than he is at sum 3.
Well, and it uses this 2-linked arm in a very cool way, where it is able to move it like exactly here, like through all this stuff that's going on.
Clutch swing.
Yeah.
That is a very clutch swing.
Congrats to Penapig on first place, Aluresis on second place, Spiritual Shampoo on third place, I guess Fiesta and Biggie as well on top 5. Revix, Goodbye Galaxy, Mr. Puzzle, Bambi, and OMG It's Abyss on top 10. Goodbye Galaxy, Mr. Puzzle.
Goodbye Galaxy, Mr. Puzzle. Goodbye Galaxy, Mr. Puzzle. Goodbye Galaxy, Mr. Puzzle. Goodbye Galaxy, Mr. Puzzle.